welcome everyone. It's so great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us for this first virtual tasting of 2021. It's incredible to think we've gotten this far. We're here, we're in the new year, and it's so wonderful to be able to start it with you all. My name is Sarah Rathbun. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications here at Dry Creek Vineyard, and we have been just waiting for this tasting. I'm so excited to introduce you to our speakers today. So a couple quick housekeeping items, as we all know at this point. I have everybody muted right now. It's not because I don't like you, it's because we just want to make sure we don't hear dogs barking in the background or somebody vacuuming or things like that. So thanks so much for working with us on that. We want to make sure everybody can hear all these wonderful stories. We will be using the chat feature. So there's that little button down at the bottom for chat. Please use it. We love to hear your comments, your stories, your questions, and I'll make sure that we get those answered by Kim and Dave throughout the presentation. The other thing is that we have quite a lot of people on this tasting today. So if you would rather switch your view to just whoever's speaking, there's that little kind of grid up at the top. You can change your view from gallery to speaker view, and that'll toggle between Kim and Dave while we're chatting. So without further ado, I am so thrilled to introduce our president, Kim Wallace, and our founder, David Stair, for the first time ever that we've done a tasting like this. So I hope you all enjoy.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
This is so exciting. So welcome, 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 and thank you for joining us. I see so many familiar faces. I keep toggling over to the next screen and the next screen and the next screen, and I see lots of familiar faces and friends. There is somebody who joined us today that I absolutely would be remiss if I didn't introduce her, because she definitely factors into the story of Dry Creek Vineyard. And that is my mom, Gail Gillies. There she is, and her husband, Don. And of course, my mom, Gail, helped my dad, Dave, start the winery many, 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 many years ago. So I just had to say hi to my mom. But anyway, so this is kind of fun because I'm actually sitting in my office, and of course this was my father's office back in the day, and Dad is in the cellar in the barrel room. So that's where he's located. And this idea kind of was inspired by a Q&A that we did, Dad and I did, oh gosh, I guess it was early last year, for the Santa Rosa Junior College, where they were basically interviewing him for their kind of pioneer or legend series. And so I got to be the interviewer and he was the interviewee, and we had a lot of fun. And so I'm going to sort of structure it that way, where I'm just going to ask Dad to tell it. I'm going to ask him lots of questions, and he'll tell all his stories. So I just want to change my view real quickly. So just one second. Oh, there, my mouse is lost. Where'd my mouse go? Oh my gosh, well, my mouse is lost. All right, never mind. Okay, so Dad, first of all, we have to start with the very beginning. So how did you get started? Did you grow up in a wine drinking family? You know, kind of give us the lowdown on way back when.
No, I grew up in Boston, the Boston, Massachusetts area, where you were born, or you were born in actually Chicago, but you grew up in Boston until we moved out here. But basically, I was raised in Boston, went to undergraduate school at MIT, and then got my MBA from Northwestern. And I think while I was at MIT, I served as social chairman of my fraternity house for a year. And one of the things as social chairman did was to order inexpensive beer, and nobody drank wine in those days, and booze. And one day I actually had an Uncle Ace, who would come for Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner, and he'd always bring a good bottle of wine. And I suppose my interest in wine, I originally got it from Uncle Ace. And that's kind of how I got interested in winery and wines. After my first love in life has always been railroads, and I worked for about 4 or 5 years for the Baltimore, Ohio, and Pennsylvania Railroad. And then something I always wanted to do is, my first wife, Gail, and I wanted to live overseas, so we were able to move to Germany, where I got a job working for a German steel firm. And we lived in the small town of Neuwied am Rhein. You were just a little teeny weeny tot at that time, but spent many weekends driving up and down the Rhine and the Moselle, tasting wine, and I got to know a couple of vintners. My boss was at the German company, was an avid wine aficionado. And through him, I began to develop an interest in wines. when we came back to Boston in 1969, I took a course in wine appreciation that summer from a fellow who's now a friend, Fred Eck from Classic Wines, our former importer there. And through my friendship with Fred, I began to develop an interest in the wine business. And I got a part-time job working in a wine shop in Somerville, Massachusetts. And then in March of 70, I came out to California and spent a few days at, actually, no, but let me back up. As a result of that summer class, I began to develop an interest in the wine business. And in November of 70, came out to California for a couple of weeks. I had an old high school buddy who lived in San Francisco, and he put me in touch with some friends in the wine business. And I went back to the Boston area and essentially told my family we were moving to California. In March of 71, I went to a 4-day short course at UC Davis in winemaking and that kind of stuff. And that's really what got me interested in coming out here. We moved out here in summer of 71, and I enrolled at UC Davis as a special graduate student in winemaking, studying viticulture and enology.
So what was Mom's reaction when you said, hey, I want to move to California and go back to school and become a winemaker?
I think she was flabbergasted, but I don't recall. You can have to ask her.
You can ask her later. Well, so you got your degree then at UC Davis, right?
Yeah.
And then how did you end up, was it after your graduation that you decided to start looking for property, and how did you select the Dry Creek Valley?
During school on weekends, I would drive over to Sonoma, Napa, and Mendocino, the traditional wine growing areas, a little bit down to Monterey and Livermore, but fairly soon in this search for a piece of property, it became evident that northern Sonoma County was the place to locate it. It had a history of grape growing and winemaking going back well over 100 years, back to the 1840s and 1850s. And it just seemed like the place to do it. There was a lot of property essentially on the market. It hadn't been discovered like Napa had been discovered. And in March of 72, I actually found the property where the winery is located. It's interesting, I had used a local real estate agent for a number of months, and I was displeased with him. One day I was driving down Dry Creek Road, and I stopped my car, and there was a gentleman on a tractor doing a spring disking, and it was just about March of 72. And he got off the tractor. I walked down into the vineyard, and we started chatting, and I mentioned that I was from Boston, and I wanted to buy a small piece of property to start a little winery and vineyard. He said, I know just the place for you. Elizabeth Howe wants to sell her property. Her husband passed away a year ago. She wants to sell her property. So Paul, his name was Paul LeBaron. Paul drove me down to Elizabeth's house, which is now where our accounting department is located. And he introduced me to her. And within about 5 minutes, we negotiated the whole deal. I think I paid a fair price. I didn't rob her, and I didn't get robbed. So it was very fair. It was all done on a handshake. And we bought the property, essentially closed in April of 72. And then in June of 72, you and Mom and I moved over to Healdsburg and started living here. And
it's pretty extraordinary. It's really quite extraordinary. 49 years ago.
I originally wanted to build a winery up at the house on West Dry Creek Road, but and we had the Board of Zoning Adjustments, or Board of Zoning, had their hearing, and they approved it unanimously, 5-0. And then one of the neighbors led a petition against me and got several hundred signatures to sign the petition. They didn't want a winery in West Dry Creek Road. West Dry Creek Road was not suitable for commercial wineries and visitor traffic. And so about these neighbors appealed it to the Board of Supervisors. And about 3 days before the actual appeal hearing was heard, I got a call from our former supervisor, Hank Spomer. And he said, Dave, can you come in and see me? You've created quite a ruckus in Dry Creek. And so I went down and saw him, and he said, I understand you own the property at the corner of Lambert Bridge and Dry Creek Road. Yes, sir, I do. Well, we're going to force you to build the winery there. Believe me, that's a heck of a lot better site to build a winery than on West Dry Creek Road. And, and looking back, I'm so glad my neighbors, opposed my building in the winery at our old house on West Dry Creek Road, because this is the ideal spot in the valley. And it's a great location we have the best location in Dry Creek.
Absolutely. I mean, no question. So rumor has it that you're a big advocate for Sauvignon Blanc. And the question I have is, why did you choose Sauvignon Blanc? Why did you decide to plant that at that time?
I had always liked French Sauvignon Blanc, Sancerres and Pouilly Fumés very well. And I remember after we bought the property, I hired Dale Good, who at that time was the leading viticulturist in our area. And I had him out here. We got a backhoe out here and started, that's a picture, started digging holes. And I said, what do you think it would go well here? And they said, well, I'd put Chardonnay and Gewürztraminer if it's a white, and Pinot Noir, or I think Gamay Beaujolais if you want a red. And I said, what about Sauvignon Blanc? And they said, no, it won't grow here. Well, I went ahead and planted Sauvignon Blanc because it was probably my favorite wine from France. And as it turned out, Sauvignon Blanc, I think, is the ideal white variety for Dry Creek Valley.
Were there other varietals planted in Dry Creek Valley at that time?
Yeah, I think the main variety was probably Zinfandel and probably some Cabernet and other lesser varieties like Alicante Boucher and Carignan and
Right.
varieties which are out of favor right now for making wine.
So you decided you were going to plant Sauvignon Blanc against everybody's advice. Tell us about that very first harvest in 1972, and maybe now would be a good time, everybody, just to have a little sip if you haven't already. Start tasting the Fumé Blanc, since that would be the wine that was the debut wine.
I see you provided no spit bucket.
Oh no. Well, we don't
need one. Anyways, our first Sauvignon Blanc producer or supplier was Joe Rocchioli,
right?
Who had some very good Sauvignon Blanc down on West Side Road, south of, actually in the Russian River Valley. But we bought Joe's Sauvignon Blanc for 2 or 3 years, and
So did you make the first vintage of Fumé Blanc here at the winery, or where did you make it? Tell us about that harvest.
Our first harvest was 72, and we had no facility at that time. And I ended up, the folks who used to own Cuvée Winery over in Calistoga in the Napa Valley were good friends. And so we actually had our fruit trucked over there. And we actually set up 4 tanks and a wine press there, and crushed and fermented our first year's wines there. That was the Joe's Sauvignon Blanc. Thanks, I don't really need it though. Joe's Sauvignon Blanc and our first Chenin Blanc. We bought actually from the grapes from Cuvée. They had excess from their vineyard, so we bought that. And then our first Chardonnay supplier was Robert Young Vineyard over in Alexander Valley. Right.
I remember, Dad, a story about, I believe it was the first harvest, and it had something to do with chewing gum.
Yes, that's true. Bob Young sold us a truckload of Sauvignon Blanc, of Chardonnay, and he said, Dave, I don't really want to waste my time driving over to Calistoga. Can you have one of your guys drive my truck over there? And I said, sure. And our one employee at that time, one outside employee, was a fellow, Mike Ruggie. And Mike was an awfully nice guy who loved to chew chewing gum, bubble gum. And Bob's old truck sprung a leak in the radiator halfway over to Calistoga, and overheated. And he had to stop and get some water from a local household. And to plug up the leak in the radiator, he chewed a big wad of chewing gum. He shoved it in the radiator, and the truck was able to limp into Cuvée Zone. We unloaded, and then I'm not sure how it got back, but that's how we got the first load of grapes.
I love that story. I love that story. So why did you decide to call it Fumé Blanc? Why didn't you just call it Sauvignon Blanc?
I remember having lunch one day with Barney Fetzer, who started Fetzer Winery. And I said, Barney, why do you call your wine Fumé Blanc? And he said, well, it sells better than Sauvignon Blanc. And he then told me that one year they bottled out of a tank of Sauvignon Blanc. What was bottled before noon was bottled as Sauvignon Blanc, or labeled as Sauvignon Blanc. What was bottled after lunch was labeled Fumé Blanc. Exact same wine. And he said the Fumé Blanc outsold the Sauvignon Blanc 3-1. And Robert Mondavi is the fellow who's credited with coming up with the name Fumé Blanc, because he had, I think in 1968, he had a lot of nice Sauvignon Blanc which we couldn't sell, so we came up with a name change and it sold. And since my basic job is to sell wine, we called it Fumé Blanc. I think the name is somewhat out of favor right now, and more and more wineries are now selling their Sauvignon Blanc as Sauvignon Blanc and not as Fumé Blanc.
Well, it's not out of favor here. So was there anybody that took notice of that first vintage? Like, and how did you go out and sell it? What did you do?
The very first wine we sold was the 72 dry Chenin Blanc. And I did my own selling myself. I put a couple of a case of samples in the back of the car. We had a big old Ford station wagon. I drive around. I had been given a list of maybe the top 50 wine shops in Northern California by Mike Richmond, who used to be the winemaker at Freemark Abbey. And so I called these stores up and made an appointment and went down and saw them. And I was able to sell it that way. That wine was probably released in March or April of '73. And Robert Finnegan, who was the main wine writer in Northern California at the time. This is before the Wine Spectator and all those other guys. But Finnegan had a private guide to wines, and in his May or June issue, he raved about our 72 Chenin Blanc as being the best Chenin Blanc he's ever tasted, and certainly an outstanding wine from a brand new winery. And as a result of that one article, we sold the entire 500 cases within a couple of weeks. Our next release was the Fumé Blanc, the 72 Fumé Blanc made from Rocaille Sauvignon Blanc. And he liked that so much, he rated it as the best Sauvignon Blanc of that year. And as a result, those two reviews kind of put us on the wine map and made it a lot easier to sell wine.
Gosh, I love that. I love that.
In a winery, it starts off, it's very nice to have some very glowing reviews by major wine writers right off the bat.
Absolutely. So you were the winemaker, you were the very first winemaker, right? And
yes and no.
And did you really know what you were doing, or was there a lot of luck?
Not really. I think in '73, I think a friend of mine, Tom Dalinger, who went on to start Dalinger Winery. Tom worked for about 6 months as kind of the winemaker, consulting winemaker, kind of telling me and guiding me what to do. And then the following year, we had Fred Brander from Brander Vineyards down in Santa Barbara. Fred kind of helped out. And then in '74, I think we hired John Jaffrey as our winemaker. And John made the wines from '74 or '5. I think he left in '81. And then Larry Levine took over for a number of years.
Right. So with respect to this Fumé Blanc, everybody's got it in their glass. I've got it in my glass. You've got it in your glass.
Yeah.
How would you say our Fumé Blanc has changed stylistically over the years? Of course, everyone knows that Tim Bell is our fabulous winemaker, and he does a terrific job with it, but I'm curious how you think it may have changed, or how did you make it differently?
I think one of the things that made our wines, I think, unique at the time is we picked the grapes at a little bit less degree of ripeness, normally at about 21 degrees Brix. Most winemakers would pick it at between 22 and 23. And a little less ripe character, less ripe grape, the character of the wine is a little bit more aggressive, a little more grassy, kind of asparagus, kind of more New Zealand-like in style. And I think a lot of people have called our Sauvignon Blanc the most New Zealand style California Sauvignon Blanc.
So was that kind of a groundbreaking style almost 50 years ago? Like, do you remember what the style of Sauvignon Blancs, like, how did it compare to the other ones in the market?
Well, ours was non-oak aged.
Right.
Initially, it was not aged in oak. In fact, it's still not aged in oak.
Right.
But a lot of people were aging it in oak, picking it riper. And to me, the wine just had less of that nice, fresh, herbal, kind of grassy Sauvignon Blanc character. Well, and also younger vineyards tend to have more of that character. The more mature a vineyard is, I think the less of that assertive grassiness there is.
Right. Well, we, as everybody knows, have worked really hard to retain that kind of hallmark style that Dad started and that continues to be our calling card.
Hey, Kim.
Yes.
So we do have a couple questions on the chat. One of them was from the Prestons asking Dave, how easy was it to come to the area and be kind of a newbie or an outsider? Were you welcomed, or were you viewed as an interloper?
I think I was viewed as an interloper, this upstart from Boston coming out here trying to tell us what to do.
Yeah.
And I think you're probably considered a local, but I'm still an outsider.
So of course, when you arrived, the Dry Creek Valley was not a recognized appellation.
Yeah.
However, I know you had a very major role in it becoming a recognized appellation. Do you remember that process?
Well, one year we put on the label Dry Creek Valley as the appellation, indirectly left off Sonoma County, and the BATF, which kind of controls the wine labeling procedures. There's one, it says Dry Creek Valley. They said you got to start putting on Dry Creek Valley of Sonoma County. And then eventually in I think the late 70s or early 80s, enough wineries wanted to come up with the appellation Dry Creek Valley. And at that time, the whole California appellation movement was in full swing. And so we were able to convince the BATF that Dry Creek Valley was an acceptable appellation.
Now, I thought you told me many years ago, but maybe I'm mistaken. I thought did you actually help draw the kind of the lines on the map to sort of to mark the region? Were you part of that?
Well, I think I was part of the group that did it. It was, I think the main, I'm not sure who actually drew the lines, but the Dry Creek Valley was basically defined as the watershed of Dry Creek Valley, which goes way over towards the mountain or way over towards the ocean on the west side of the valley. And of course, it goes to the top of the ridgeline between the hills that separate Dry Creek from Alexander Valley.
But you were a huge champion of Dry Creek Valley, yes, obviously, and yes, so smart to take the name of the valley for the winery. Thank you for doing that, by the way, Dad. Thank you for not calling it after our name, last name.
Cellars or cellar stairs. Or...
Exactly. So I kind of wanted to shift a little bit to Chenin Blanc, which is what I'm drinking next. And very much, we have a love affair with Chenin here, as everybody knows on this tasting. How did you fall in love with Chenin? Was it, was it inspired by a trip to the Loire Valley, or?
Yes, well, actually, Fred Eck, our friend in Boston, who taught the course in wine appreciation that I took back in 1970, was the American representative for Domaine Beaumard, a leading producer of Chenin Blanc in the Loire Valley. And I just liked the wine. And frankly, our initial emphasis with white wines is I didn't have the financial backing to make wines that you had to age for 2 or 3 years to sell. I had to sell wines, within a year in order to just stay in business.
So you couldn't afford the barrels? Couldn't afford
the barrels, and couldn't afford the holding time, the cost of keeping the wine in barrels for a year or two. But our first Chenin Blanc came from a vineyard over in Napa. And again, we bought the fruit through Cuvée, and it's.
Oh, there it is. That even has a Napa Valley appellation.
Yeah, it's interesting because, back in the early 70s, I think the leading California white varietal wine was Chenin Blanc. I think at one time Robert Mondavi and Charles Krug, which are the same branches of the same family, that was their main white wine, and literally hundreds of thousands of cases were made. I think we were the only producer of dry Chenin Blanc left in Sonoma County. Pine Ridge still makes one in Napa, but it's a lot of Viognier in their version of it. I don't know if Chapelet still has one. Our friends at Kenwood used to make a very nice Chenin Blanc, and for the last 25 years, the source of our fruit for Chenin Blanc has been the Wilson Vineyard over in Clarksburg, over south of Sacramento, and it's a wonderful wine, I think. And I'm so happy we're the only person that makes it, because if a restaurant wants to have a wine on their wine list that's Chenin Blanc, they've got to pick ours.
That's what we say around here. So didn't the White House serve the Chenin Blanc during a couple of administrations? Yeah,
I think during the Ford administration, it was served at a couple of White House dinners. Gerald Ford was president, and I think the guest of honor was the president of Egypt, who I vaguely recall was Mubarak.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure that that's his name because there have been a number of presidents in Egypt over the last 50 years, but I think it was Mubarak.
Sorry, go on.
No, I think unfortunately he went out of style and was probably arrested for something. I don't know.
What I love about these menus is the style of cuisine is just so reflective of that era. You know, the peach melba, the filet of sole Veronique. I mean, you don't see that a lot on restaurants and, you know, menus anymore. But anyway, so that must have really helped sort of get a lot of good PR for the winery to have said that the White House was serving our Chenin.
It did, I think, yes.
So, you know, I'm thinking about you all by yourself, maybe with your one employee, and of course, mom was helping you. But it must have been hard to get out and sell them. So how did you actually, I mean, aside from visiting those 50 Northern California retail accounts, how did you get your wines in distribution? Like, how did you do that?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I think initially we did our own distribution in California, and occasionally I'd go down to Southern California and with some samples and go around the stores and taste them. Again, the stores were given to me by Mike Richmond. And then I'd come back here and load up a U-Haul truck with a couple hundred cases of wine and drive down and deliver it myself. That ended very quickly because it was a real pain in the butt to do that kind of work. Our first out-of-state distributor was the Gluntz Company from Chicago. And I very vividly remember the story that I was down fixing a water well for the winery, covered with mud and sawing of plastic pipes and gluing of pipes. And my wife walked down and said, Dave, we've got a visitor who wants to talk about selling our wine. And I said, well, tell him I'm busy, have him come back tomorrow. And she said, well, he's with me. Why don't you turn around and talk to him yourself? And I said, whoops. And that's how I met Joe Gluntz. And the Gluntz family have been strong supporters of Dry Creek ever since. Joe's family, the Gluntz family, was at one time the largest Schlitz distributor in the world. Schlitz Brewery, unfortunately, went out of business, but they were basically a beer distributor. And Joe Jr. or Joe Sr., who's one of the sons of the founder, liked wine. So we started the wine division, and I think it's now run by one of his sons.
Yep. Well, ironically, I just spoke to Joe Jr. just this morning.
He's actually on this call watching this right now.
Oh,
Joe, hi, say hi to your folks for me.
So when, you know, obviously you couldn't do what you did then, Dad, today. I mean, it couldn't be done, I don't think, but you did it. And I guess one of the questions I have is, how long did it take for the winery to become a viable business? Like, when did you actually turn a profit? And you know, what was that like?
Well, you know, the wine business, you start off spending wine and then you don't get money until you sell it. And we had to build up a certain volume. And I think in our first year in 72, we made about 1,300 cases of wine. In 73, which is the first year we did the work here at the winery, we made about 6,000, and we grew up to about 10 or 12,000. And in 1977, I remember getting a call from our former CPA, Ron Conti, saying, Dave, I've got great news for you. You made 6 months, in the first 6 months of this year, you actually made $28 profit. I was very overjoyed. And I remember later that summer, one of our minority stockholders parents lived up in Seattle, and she was up visiting her parents, and I was up in Seattle, and I ended up taking Gail Adams out to dinner, and blew our entire profit plus some on that dinner. But that was the first year we actually made money, and then since then it's become somewhat profitable and sometimes very profitable.
Well, let's so while maybe everybody might, for those of you who have the wines, maybe start tasting the Chardonnay, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But one thing I know, a lot of people on this call have been to, obviously, the winery. They've been to the Dry Creek Valley, and they've been to Passport to Dry Creek Valley, which sadly was canceled this past year due to COVID. But I wanted to ask you about your role in developing that entire event.
Well, for a number of years, as you may recall, was on the board of directors of the Nautical Heritage Society. As you know, my hobby, or family's hobby, has been sailing. And the Nautical Heritage Society owned and operated the tall ship, the California, which is a replica of a 1850s Coast Guard revenue cutter. And one of the things that the California had was a passport. It would basically, every summer, go up and down the coast of California, and every port it put in they would take paying customers out on rides. And we developed a passport for every time you went on the ship, you got your passport checked. And I thought, no, let's call our event Passport to Dry Creek Valley. And if you go to all the wineries in the valley over the weekend, or a certain number of them, you got some kind of a prize. I'm not sure what I don't recall if it was a prize, but it was some kind of award. But that's how Passport became started. And I don't know if we still use passports, but initially we had little passports.
No, we
Everybody
don't.
we still have them?
Well, they did before when it was an in-person
Okay.
event. Yeah. Now, well, Sarah can speak to that. She's been very involved with the Wine Growers of Dry Creek Valley to try to reimagine that event in this new world that we live in.
Good.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're working on all the different options for that, so that people who are nearby and can come safely taste with us will be able to, and other people will be able to connect with us virtually, just like this.
Let's do one of these tastings for Passport next spring.
There you go. Well, Dave, actually, yeah, and Kim, you could speak to this. Speaking about our nautical heritage, we did get a question from Sue about why the sailboat on the labels.
Oh yeah. Well, that's the $1 million question around here. Dad, do you want to answer that?
Our initial label, which you were on the screen a minute ago, began to look very dated in the early 80s. And I think one day you and your husband Don and I were out sailing we used to have a family sailboat in San Francisco Bay, out sailing on the bay one nice sunny Sunday afternoon or Saturday afternoon. And someone came up with the idea, let's come up with a nautical theme. So that's where we came up with the nautical theme. The very first one we used, that's our old label, but I think in '85 was our first nautical themed.
Actually, it was 82. I don't know if we have that collage.
It was a reserve. It was the
Right, the David Ester Reserve Red, 1982.
And the
Yep.
reason we called it David Ester is there was a move underfoot that wineries that had names of geographical significance had to have all the fruit in that wine from that particular appellation. And we didn't do that, of course, since we source fruit from other areas in Sonoma County. So for a couple of years, we tried David Ester as a brand name, with the idea if they ultimately went through with that ruling, we would change the name of the winery or the wine to David Ester. Fortunately, they never did.
This picture in the top left, Dad, of you with the Zinfandel sailboat, is that when you, tell us about that. Does that have something to do with your involvement with the Sonoma State sailing team?
Sonoma State University used to have a very competitive intercollegiate sailing team. And they, like so many schools back in the early 80s, were short of funding for athletics. And they were thinking about dropping the sailing program because it's a sport that doesn't generate revenue like basketball or football or baseball does. And somehow I found out about it, and we decided to donate some money to buy a sailboat. And the first sailboat was called Zinfandel. And interesting, Peter Homburg, who was one of the sailors on the Sonoma State University sailing team at that time, was originally from St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. He went on to represent St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands in one of the America's Cup. They never made it to the finals, but then he became the tactician on one of the boats that actually did race in the America's Cup. I forget which one it was, but that's kind of our connection, one of our connections with sailing.
I love that. Well, I know we've got a couple of sailors on this call. I saw a few names that I know are avid sailors. No, and I just remember all the years that I was a teenager and growing up, and when Don and I were first married, we spent every weekend out on the San Francisco Bay with Dad when he had his sailboat. We had two.
As I recall, you didn't like sailing. You liked to lie out on the front deck in your bikini and
Well, I don't know, something like that.
Okay.
Anyway, well, so the Chenin Blanc. Just curious, Dad. How would you say this compares to the original style of Chenin? Because I've been told, and we've had the great, wonderful privilege here of tasting some of our older Chenins. In fact, our 1990 vintage is one of my personal favorites. But how would you say this has changed, or is it real similar to what you really envisioned?
The first 2 or 3 years we made Chenin Blanc, it was finished totally dry with no absence of any fermentable sugar. And sometimes it tasted a little bit austere. So we decided, I think back in the early to mid 70s, maybe late 70s, excuse me, of leaving about 0.5% sugar in the wine. We still call it dry, but it doesn't take, it's not sweet, but it's not bone dry. And to me, it's a
Right.
perfectly balanced wine. Of course, it's non-oak aged.
Right.
This wine is kind of patterned after Beaumard's Savennier from France. And I remember the summer of '75, you and I think Romy was my other daughter was about a 4-year-old girl. You were, I think, a early teenager. We spent a month in Rochefort-sur-Loire living at Jean's house in the middle of his vineyard. And all you wanted to do was go buy French blue jeans, as I recall.
As many 13-year-olds want to do, right?
Yes.
Oh, that's great. I love it. Well, so I kind of wanted to shift to your thoughts on how you think the industry has changed. I mean, obviously you were the first here in Dry Creek Valley. You were such a pioneer in Sonoma County and in California, but the industry's changed a lot. So how would you compare those early days of Sonoma County to maybe today's industry as you perceive it?
I think the wineries that started off in the early to mid '70s were started by people with a little bit of money and a lot of desire and
Passion.
keen passion and interest in wine. And I think over the last 50 years, the industry has become more dominated by big corporations. A lot of big corporations have bought up some of the small independent. I remember that picture very well.
I love that.
We actually, for a while, had 3 600-gallon wooden tanks with a very tiny, narrow door. We had to employ one man because he was skinny to get in and clean those tanks out.
I love that. What was that? Was that Zinfandel or Cabernet or what is that?
I can't tell from here.
Gosh. Well, so it's obviously it's become very corporate, and as everybody knows, there's a lot of wineries that are now owned by big corporations. Any other thoughts on how it's changed?
I think that's one of the main things. I think the other thing is the distribution of wine has become so constant. A lot of the small independent distributors have gone out of business, and it's in some states it's hard to find a distributor. And if I were a young winery today, a new winery, you'd have a very hard time finding distributors if you wanted to sell anywhere other than maybe 1 or 2 states. As I say, as we've said, most of our old independent distributors have been bought up. Glunt's company is still privately owned, and
I think they're in their 5th generation, if I'm not.
Still one of our best distributors. They do a great job, and I wish we had more guys like that out there.
So true, so true. So not to be negative, but what are some of your regrets, if you have any?
I think one of the things I would say is not being more aggressive in buying land 40 years ago when it was more reasonably priced. Today, it's kind of hard to justify buying a vineyard because what we ended up paying, $2,500 an acre for is now $100,000 an acre.
Right.
In Napa, it's $250 an acre.
Right. Well, should we taste a little Chardonnay?
Sure.
All right. So this wine has undergone a really big transformation, and of course Tim Bell gets a lot of credit for that. We've made big changes. I don't know what was the Chardonnay like in your early days? What were you trying to achieve?
We were trying to achieve a balanced, middle of the road Chardonnay with some oakiness. I think the first couple of years we did not malolactic, and then we started doing malolactic, which kind of creates a more buttery, more complex style. But unfortunately, the malolactic induced Chardonnays tend not to age very well. There's a picture of myself and Bob Young.
I know, I love that.
When we first bought Chardonnay from Bob. That's
Bob passed away, what, about 5 years ago?
5 or 10 years ago. His kids run the Robert Young Winery now, which didn't exist back when I was started off. But
right, which is a great winery to visit if next time you guys are all out here. I love that place.
Yes.
Well, our Chardonnay, so I'm just looking at the stat sheet, and it still undergoes malolactic fermentation, about 45%. It's also 90% barrel fermented. But probably the biggest change would be the appellation. This is 100% Russian River, obviously from DCV10. Yeah. So that first vintage was all Alexander Valley fruit, right? So a little warmer climate influence, maybe.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's funny, Alexander Valley for a number of years, and particularly Robert Young Vineyard, had an outstanding reputation. Chateau St. Jean used to make their best Chardonnay, exclusive from Robert Young fruit. And for the first 2 or 3 years that we made his wine, we put his name on the label. And then I think Chateau St. Jean decided that they had a proprietary use interest in their name, and they asked us not to do it, and to avoid a lawsuit, we didn't do it.
Always good to avoid the lawsuits.
Yes. The only one in a lawsuit are lawyers, I think.
That's so true. No, I really love this wine. I really love it. I enjoy it a great deal. Now, this is a great photograph of kind of the transition of all the labels. And I see there in the 1985 Chardonnay, you actually called that Sailor's Chardonnay. How did that come about? You see the second label in the middle at the top?
I don't know. Where'd that come from? That was your idea, I think.
No, that was before I came to work for the winery, because I came here, well, I came here in 86. Maybe I wasn't, I don't know. I don't remember. Isn't that funny?
I don't either.
Oh my gosh. The years are just.
At that time, you were director of fun stuff.
I was director of fun stuff, which basically meant I did all the stuff that Dad didn't want to do, and I tried to make it sound fun. So I gave myself a jazzy title. So Dad, obviously, gosh, we're coming up on our 50th anniversary next year, and it's quite a story. What has been your biggest source of pride?
I think starting and building a successful business that has, withstood the ups and downs of the wine business and is under very capable new leadership, which will continue to succeed, I think.
Wouldn't you also say just the family ownership? Because
yes, yeah.
I think, anybody who's worked in a family business knows it's not easy. And I've seen, I know you've seen the demise of a lot of great family wineries, and then really almost the demise of the families, where the family is torn apart. The family doesn't get along. The brothers and sisters don't talk to each other. And I think, I can imagine that probably one of your greatest sources of pride is that we all love each other. We really do. And I think that's huge. I love this picture. Of course, a lot of the folks today know Dawn, my husband, Dawn. We just had our 39th wedding anniversary, and it's insane.
We look so young, though.
I know we do look young. I know, Sarah, maybe we need to stop showing this picture because it just shows how much we've aged. I love the picture though of me that was the old tasting room. I was definitely underage. I was probably about 13, and I love the calendar on the wall, which is the sailing calendar.
Yeah.
It just is funny. So one of the questions that we thought people would be interested in, and I feel sort of silly asking it, but it was sent to me, was, what was it like having Kim come into the family business?
Do I have to answer that?
You can take a pass.
No, it was
being recorded.
It's very good. Kim, without boasting about you, you've done a great job.
What was I like in the early days?
I really can't say that. No, you were very good. Is that one of the Guy Buffet bottles?
It is.
Where is that bottle now?
I have no idea, but maybe you should explain to everybody what the Guy Buffet bottle means.
Guy Buffet is a well-known French artist who used to live half a year in Paris and half a year in Maui. And I met him probably 25 or 30 years ago, once in Maui. I went into the Lahaina galleries and ended up buying one of his pictures. The guy who sold it to me, would you like to meet Guy? He's on the island right now. And so the next day we went over to Guy's apartment or house, and we chatted for 10 minutes, and it was very pleasant. And he said, if you ever get to Paris, let me know. I'd love to show you around Paris. And a year or so later, I was in Paris on a business trip, or I think it was a business trip. And we ended up meeting together and having lunch on a Saturday. And then he took me to a French antique auction. He was looking for something, and we developed a friendship. And then I said, would you ever like to paint a picture or do some work for Dry Creek? He said, sure. The next time I'm in California, I'll let you know. And he came here a year or two later and painted a very lovely picture of the winery, which I think is hanging. I'm not sure if it's in the tasting room or up in the conference room, of the kind of a stylized view of Dry Creek Valley, with the winery in the background and a little panel truck driving down the road, delivering Dry Creek wine. And he also did a portrait of me. In one of his more famous pictures is a French sommelier. Did a picture of me as a French sommelier holding a bottle of Dry Creek. I'm not sure where that actual picture is.
It's right outside my office, Dad.
Cool.
It wasn't Guy Buffet also the artist that did the, what's the famous champagne bottle with
Yes, Perrier-Jouet
the
or
Perrier-Jouet, yeah, Perrier-Jouet bottle.
he is his two themes for a long time were the wine industry, both California and France and Hawaii. And unfortunately, I ended up buying ultimately 3 of his originals and 3 or 4 prints, and he ended up giving a bronze casting of his sommelier, which unfortunately I lost in the fire 3 years ago. That when our house burned down in the Tubbs fire 3 years ago, I lost all those pictures.
Oh, that's terrible.
Those are things you can't replace.
Absolutely not. Well, so when I came to work here in 1986, and my recollection, you said, well, I want you to go sell wine. I said, okay, great. How do I do that? You said, well, here's the wines, here's a bag, drive to San Francisco and figure it out. And so that's basically what my training was. It was definitely sink or swim. But I think in hindsight, that was probably one of the best things that I could, the best ways to learn, right? Jump right in.
You at that time, our sales agency was Pat Ellsworth.
Right, that's right.
And Pat, you worked with Allison Lehman, I'm sure, is one of his sales reps.
Right, I was the fly on the wall, listening to everything they said and trying to figure it out. And at one point, I remember coming to you. This was after I'd been working for the winery for probably 1 or 2 years, and I said, Dad, I'm calling on all these very, the sort of highfalutin sommeliers and wine buyers in San Francisco. And I was pretty young. And I said, they don't really take me seriously. I need a really good title. So then we came up with the title Vice President / DOB. Do you remember that? And DOB was daughter of the boss. But I told all these customers that it was director of beverages. I made it sound like I had some fabulous credential, which I didn't. But we had an inside sort of joke about that for years. So Vice President DOB.
Well, to me, my funniest story about your early sales trips was the time you were in New York City with Jim Pedroncelli and probably Tim Murphy and a couple of people. And you said, I'll treat everybody for dinner tonight. And you went to hand the...
We were at Oriole, which was Charlie Palmer's fancy debut restaurant in New York.
And anyways, you had it on your credit card, it bounced. You had to get Jim Pedroncelli to bail you out.
I did. I remember that. I think I had like a $250 limit, and I had offered to pay for like 8 people or something in New York City. And this was, of course, well over 30 years ago, but still my credit limit was very low. It took me many years, everybody, to gain Dad's trust. So I actually had my credit.
Oh, it didn't take that long.
Anyway, well, so is there a 3rd generation? This is what we always get asked.
Yeah, I hope so. Unfortunately, I have 2 wonderful, or I shouldn't say I have 2 wonderful grandkids. The picture there is Spencer on the right and Taylor, his older sister, although Spencer looks older than Taylor in that picture. And Spencer is I guess a senior at Montana State, majoring in fishing. His passion is fishing. And I think he wants to become a fishing guide in Montana for a number of years. Whether he'd consider going into the wine business eventually, I don't know. Taylor, my granddaughter, to my right, and to Spencer's left, is I guess you call her, she's a professional blogger.
Yep, she's a social media influencer, right?
And I think is doing quite well at that, but they've decided that Sonoma County is too expensive to live in, so they're going to try living in Bozeman, Montana, near where Spencer lives, and see how they like it, and whether they stay up there or not. I kind of hope they do and they don't, but they would be the ones, I think, the posse might take over working at the winery one day.
Well,
her fiance Dylan is a wonderful guy, and maybe he might end up doing it too.
That's right. Well, about once a year, I talk with the kids, and they have made it very clear that it's not out of the question, but they really want to, as I had an opportunity when I was their age.
I think it's every child should explore their own desires and interests.
Absolutely.
If they really want to a family business, it's their decision.
Absolutely. Well, so since you've been retired now, I guess officially since 2006, but I think you probably, when I look back, I think it was really oh, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, where you finally really got comfortable with retirement, the notion of it.
Yeah.
So what are some of your hobbies and interests since you've been retired?
Well, you know, it's funny. I'd say my main hobby and interest is music. When I was in high school, I played trombone and banjo, and trombone in the high school marching band and concert band, and banjo in a small Dixieland combo that we started. And after graduation from high school, I never touched either instrument for 55 years. Although occasionally, as I recall, I would get out my trombone on a Saturday night and put on some New Orleans jazz records and play trombone to that, probably when I had one or two glasses of too much wine. And I don't know if you recall that, but I'm sure you were embarrassed if you ever heard it. But I started playing about, maybe 10 years ago. I met Lou Sabrana, who had been the high school band teacher when Kim was in high school, and taught Kim how to become a very accomplished flute player. She actually won the 8th grade student prize for the best music student in Hillsburg Junior High School. But I asked Lou, what is he doing? And he says, I'm running the New Horizons Band of Sonoma County. What's that? That's retired folks playing music. Do you play any instruments? And I said, yeah, I have an old trombone and an old banjo, but I haven't touched them in 50 years. And he said, well, we can't use the banjo. We can always use another trombone player. So I started playing trombone with that group, with the New Horizons Band. And then about a year later, they started a Dixieland combo and needed a banjo player. So I got my old banjo out. And now banjo has become my major instrument. And I try to play the banjo at least an hour or two a day. I was playing it this morning. I'll play it when I get home tonight. Unfortunately, my trombone has been sitting since COVID, and we no longer have the New Horizons Band. But I did notice earlier, one of my trumpet playing friends is on our tasting. Charles,
oh, really? Today?
Yeah, Charles Newman from Napa. Hi, Charles.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that.
He's on the call.
I love that. Well, I know we have a lot of questions in the chat feature, and I think maybe what I'll just do is ask you one final thing, and then maybe we can just touch on a couple of questions that have come in. So any parting words, you know, for everybody on the call, or just thoughts that you want to finish with?
Well, I think, you know, our early motto around here was life is too short to drink bad wine. And that still holds today, especially during COVID, and you can't go out, you got to be home. You might as well have dinner with a good bottle of wine than a cheap bottle of wine.
Very true. Very true. And we're really, really grateful that everybody here is choosing our wines.
Yes.
So Sarah, should we take a quick peek at some of these really great questions?
Perfect. Well, one kind of going off of that was, we've had some questions about what's the best selling wine of the winery? You know, what's your favorite wine? Maybe you want to touch on that.
Dad or me?
My favorite
Let's both
is Sauvignon Blanc or Sauvignon Blanc, our new Sauvignon Blanc.
Yep, I would agree. I think it's really hard to answer the question of what's your favorite. It's really, really dependent on the season, what we're eating, etc. I have to be honest, I drink a lot of the Heritage Vines Zinfandel. I drink a lot of the Spencer's Hill Zinfandel. I drink a lot of the Taylor's Vineyard Sauvignon Musqué. I love the Mariner on special occasions. I love the Endeavor Cabernet. And of course, Chenin. I mean, Chenin is, I'm looking forward to about another month and a half, 2 months from now, when I will consider it time to start drinking a lot of Chenin as the weather warms up here.
Yeah, we bottled the 2000. 2000.
Nope, we're just getting ready to. I just tasted the final blend, and actually it's delicious. So
good.
Yep.
Right. Well, I know we have a couple of students from an advanced wine class at Florida State University today, and we happen to get a question that I think they'll be really interested in, is that 2 of the wines that we tasted today had screw caps and 1 had cork. Why? What are we using? Why did we come up with that decision?
Let me start off. Cork has obviously been the traditional finish for fine wines for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And I remember about 12 years ago being in Washington, D.C., in a store there where we do a lot of good business in Washington. And there was a rack of New Zealand wines, all with screw caps, and a little brochure about why they're having these screw caps. I bought a bottle and brought it home, and brought the brochure, and I showed it to Kim, and Kim said, Dad, we're not going to use screw caps. It's not a good idea. And then later on, I thought, maybe we shouldn't. But eventually, how come we made the decision to go to screw caps?
Well, I think, it's true. I was very against the idea. I felt that I was worried about the perception, that it had did not represent the quality of the wines, quite frankly. And I was worried about not so much, with white wines, but with the ageability factor. And I think what kind of changed my mind is recognizing that restaurants were really, really, really advocating for screw caps, especially for by the glass programs. And so we, of course, really were looking to have our Chenin or Fumé and some of these wines as in by the glass. And so adding the screw cap made them a little more attractive to restaurateurs. And so one of the reasons, we don't screw cap the Chardonnay. And of course, the Chardonnay is essentially, we make so little of it now, it's essentially exclusive to the wine club. And but with the Chenin and the Fumé Blanc, which we do sell, to retail stores and restaurants, they like it, and so we've stuck with it. And plus, even though both these wines, we know that they age well, they're not really intended for aging. So, they're intended to drink when they're young and refreshing and all of that. But the screw cap, as everybody knows, we do not screw cap any of the red wines. I've been asked about it, and I maintain that I don't want to move in that direction. Mostly because of the unknown factor of how it will affect aging. So,
I think one of the I think positive benefits of screw caps is there's a phenomenon of corkiness.
Right. Well, that's the main reason.
A number of years ago, the percentage of bad corks was running 2 to 3%, which meant if you opened a couple of cases of wine, you'd have at least one bottle that tasted off. And there was that's when I think screw caps got their big impetus in this country. Is just
definitely. And of course,
that problem.
And since then, the cork industry has made huge advances. So, yeah, I just saw a quick one of the questions that just flew up on my screen was how many vineyards do we own, and how many grapes or growers do we work with? So I'll just answer that. We own 10 estate vineyards. Here in Dry Creek Valley and also in Russian River Valley. We used to have a vineyard in Alexander Valley many years ago, but we sold that. So our focus is really Dry Creek Valley. And we also buy grapes from a lot of little local growers here in Dry Creek Valley. And I think one of the biggest sources of pride I have, and I know you have, and the winery team has, is these really long-term relationships with growers. Some of them going back well over 40 years. And no harvest, or I guess the harvest that most recent one, which was so difficult, those partnerships with those growers and working together, it really, our relationships it was so rewarding. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So we and like Dad said, the mistake he made is he didn't buy more land. Well, unfortunately we can't own everything. Wish we could, but we have the best of both worlds by having access to these wonderful grapes that our growers grow.
I just was handed a note that we have a birthday boy on board, a Jerry O'Neill. So Jerry, happy birthday.
Well, cheers, Jerry. Happy birthday.
Yes, cheers.
Awesome.
And we did have a couple of questions about things that we have made and things if we might make. So one question was from Matt asking if we're going to ever bring back the Soleil. So maybe Kim, you could touch on.
Yes, we are, Matt. Yes, have no fear. Yes, we will have Soleil. We only make Soleil when which is our late harvest botrytis Sauvignon Blanc Semillon blend. We only do that in the years when we achieve botrytis naturally. We actually have tried to make it several times in recent years, but have not had the results we wanted. I believe, we have some from, let me think about it, Sarah, is it 2019 harvest that
I believe
so. Okay, let me say caveat.
Yes, I say.
Don't hold me to this. Yes, don't hold me to this, especially, well, I know a few people who, I'm not going to name names, but I know a few of you will hold me to this. But from the 2019 vintage, actually from the Sauvignon Blanc across the street at DCV6. And I haven't checked in with Tim lately as to, kind of the status of that, but we're hoping that that'll, be of the caliber and quality that we would bottle. The other thing that's exciting is we do have the original vineyard that Dad planted. We call it DCP3, and there's a portion of it that's getting replanted in the springtime, and we're actually planning to plant some Semillon. So, and that would be intended entirely for the Soleil.
Traditionally, French Sauternes are blends of Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc, majority being Semillon. Ours have always been predominantly Sauvignon Blanc. And unfortunately, the only problem with, I think, the Soleil is it's very hard to sell. It's a niche market, and
well, not to these guys.
It's a wonderful wine.
Well, and the Pipers were wondering on top of that if we're going to make a late harvest is in any time.
Well, same thing, Lee and Eugenia. Or is it Deb and Matt?
Yep.
Yeah, same thing. We have some in barrel, and I can't make any promises. How's that?
Perfect. And then Kenneth was wondering if we would ever make a sparkling wine.
Oh, what a great question. So this is something that we're really excited about. We are coming out with our first sparkling wine in our history. We made a sparkling Chenin Blanc, and we will be releasing it for our 50th anniversary next year. So that is, as a matter of fact, I'm gonna taste it. It's on tirage right now, and I'm gonna be tasting it with Tim and our assistant winemaker, Brian, I think at the end of February.
I want to be there.
You want to be there? Okay, deal.
Our friend Jean Beaumard makes a wonderful sparkling wine from the Loire Valley, which is Chenin Blanc based.
That's right. So,
and then Joe Glentz Jr. is asking if we're going to make a barrel-aged Chenin.
You know, Joe, we've talked about that a lot, and currently we don't have any plans to make a barrel-aged Chenin. So
right. That would change the character of the wine considerably away from our current style, which I'm not in favor of.
Right.
All right. Well, that's all the questions I have on my end. Do you guys have any parting thoughts before we let these people get on with their evening?
Well, I just want to thank everybody. You know, it's so heartwarming to see all these faces and to just know that you care enough about us to spend an hour and 5 minutes with us, probably during your dinner time or wherever, depending on where you are. And we're just so grateful for your support. It means the world to us. I hope you've enjoyed this. I know I've learned a few things from listening to Dad that I didn't even know. And I see Mom and Dawn clapping, so maybe they learned a few things, and hopefully everybody else did too. So maybe we can come back sometime later in the year and talk about maybe the red wines in the early days.
That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful. I've certainly enjoyed this, and want to thank all of you, our strong and loyal supporters, for tuning in, and stay tuned for many years of wonderful things from Dry Creek Vineyard.
Absolutely.
Right, and I will just echo that and thank you all again so much for participating with us virtually. It's so great to be able to come and see you when you can't come and see us. So one thing that we have coming up, just so you know, is our February 25th virtual tasting. That one's going to be really fun. Tim Bell, if anyone knows Tim Bell, our winemaker at this point, they know that he loves his barrels. And so he's going to be walking through 3 different wines that we have with some really interesting barrel regimens, like the Marinus with our acacia and chestnut wood, and the fusion barrels with our Zinfandels. So it's going to be a great tasting. You can sign up for that with or without the wine. So I'd encourage you to get in there early and get that taken care of. So we have another date in a month to see you all.
Oh, and one more thing I want to add, Sarah, for anybody that is, local or in Northern California, we are reopening on Friday. So we are excited to welcome guests back for tasting by appointment, obviously still outside, but we have a beautiful tent and it's decorated lovely, and there's heaters, and it's really going to be it's very pretty and festive. And the team, the staff, all of us are so excited to welcome people back onto property. So maybe we'll see you.
Absolutely. So from all of us to all of you, thank you
very much.
Thank you. And we hope to see you soon. Stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.